Welcome, dear listener, to Snug as a Bug, where dreams unfold like the turning of pages in an ancient book. Tonight, we journey to a world steeped in mystery, wonder, and forgotten tales. The lost city of Atlantis beckons, a place of unimaginable beauty, power, and secrets buried beneath the waves for centuries. Each tale is a chapter of an epic adventure, a journey through the heart of a legendary civilization. From the golden age of Atlantis to its dramatic descent beneath the waves, to the survivors who dared to rebuild, and the stirring return of the city itself. These stories weave together a tapestry of magic, wisdom, and renewal. So, settle in and let the gentle flow of the stories carry you to another world. Let the adventures unfold as you drift into a peaceful state of relaxation, knowing that each tale is designed to guide you to a place of wonder and calm. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and prepare to dive into the legends of Atlantis. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a grand ship as it glides through the shimmering ocean. The water sparkles under a soft moonlight, endless and mysterious, stretching far into the horizon. The salty breeze brushes against your skin, carrying with it a faint hum, an ancient song of the sea, whispering tales of a world lost to time. Beneath the waves, the ruins of Atlantis stir, their secrets calling out to the surface. You can feel the energy in the air, a pulse that resonates deep within your chest, like the beat of a distant drum. It's as if the ocean itself is alive, urging you to uncover what lies beneath its depths. The stars above twinkle like guides, lighting your path as you embark on this extraordinary voyage. With every gentle sway of the ship, you find yourself drawn further into the mystery, into a journey that will take you across time, through the rise and fall of a civilization, and into the heart of its rebirth. The Fall of Atlantis. Chapter 1. The sky over Atlantis darkened with storm clouds that rolled in from the horizon, as if the gods themselves were watching the city's impending destruction. The winds howled, carrying the scent of salt water and rain, and the waves that lapped against Atlantis's once pristine shores now crashed violently against the stone walls. The city, which had stood as a beacon of power and prosperity for centuries, now trembled on the edge of ruin. In the heart of the palace, King Atlas stood at the window, watching the chaos unfold. The once thriving streets were now filled with panic. People ran in all directions, seeking shelter from the violent tremors that shook the ground beneath them. The king, his face pale and drained of its former pride, could barely recognize the city he had ruled. He had thought the crystal would bring him more power, more control over the world. Instead, it had unraveled everything. The energy from the great ritual had backfired, throwing the delicate balance of Atlantis into disarray. The ground cracked, the sea surged, and the very foundations of the city began to crumble. At the temple, the high priest Callistos stood before the shattered crystal, his heart heavy with the knowledge that all hope was lost. The crystal's light, once a beacon of prosperity, had turned dark, fractured beyond repair. The energy that had once sustained Atlantis now surged uncontrollably through the city, setting off violent earthquakes and tsunamis. He knew that the time of Atlantis was over. The gods had given them this power as a gift, but it was never meant to be used for selfish gain. The city had lost its way, and now it would pay the price. Chapter 2. As the people of Atlantis scrambled for safety, the sea itself seemed to rise in rebellion. Towering waves crashed against the shores, flooding the lower levels of the city. The intricate canals that once carried water through Atlantis's gleaming streets now overflowed, turning into raging rivers that swept away anything in their path. From his vantage point in the palace, Atlas could see the sea closing in on the city, swallowing entire sections of the land. The waters rose with terrifying speed, and soon the lower districts were completely submerged. The great walls that had once protected Atlantis from invaders now stood helpless against the fury of the ocean. Atlas turned to his advisors, panic in his voice. "We must stop this. There must be a way." But the advisors, their faces ashen with fear, had no answers. The power they had unleashed was beyond their control, and now there was nothing they could do but watch as their city was consumed by the very element they had sought to dominate. In the temple, Callistos led the remaining priests in a desperate prayer to the gods. They called upon Poseidon, the god who had blessed Atlantis, to show mercy. But the gods were silent. Callistos knew that the gods had already made their judgment. The waters continued to rise, and soon they reached the steps of the temple itself. Callistos stood before the shattered crystal, feeling the energy pulse weakly in its broken form. He whispered a final prayer, not for Atlantis, but for the souls of its people. As the floodwaters surged toward him, Callistos closed his eyes and accepted the fate of the city he had served for so long. Chapter 3. The tremors grew more violent, shaking the very foundations of Atlantis. The grand towers, once symbols of the city's greatness, swayed dangerously, their marble columns cracking under the strain. The palace, perched high above the rest of the city, seemed to groan under the weight of its own magnificence. King Atlas, once so proud and powerful, now stood powerless before the destruction he had caused. He watched as his city crumbled piece by piece into the sea. The people who had once looked to him for leadership now fled in terror, their faith in their king shattered like the crystal itself. In the final moments, Atlas realized the truth. The power of Atlantis was never meant to be wielded with such arrogance. The crystal had been a gift to nurture life, not to control it. But his greed had blinded him, and now Atlantis would be buried beneath the waves, forgotten by the world. As the palace walls began to crack and collapse around him, Atlas made his way to the royal chamber, where a map of the world was spread out before him. He stared at the map, realizing that all his plans for conquest, all his dreams of expanding his empire, meant nothing now. The sea would take it all. He sank to his knees as the palace shuddered with the force of the final earthquake. The windows shattered and the walls crumbled as the ocean surged toward the heart of the city. Atlas closed his eyes, awaiting the inevitable. Chapter 4. The sea, once held at bay by the brilliance of Atlantis's engineers, now claimed the city without mercy. The mighty towers collapsed into the churning waters, the grand temples crumbled into ruins, and the streets, once filled with life and laughter, disappeared beneath the waves. As the waters rose higher, entire sections of the city were torn away by the force of the flood. The crystal, which had once powered all of Atlantis's wonders, flickered one last time before its light was extinguished forever. In the temple, Callistos stood in the rising waters, watching as the city was swallowed by the sea. He had seen this moment in his visions, the destruction of all they had built. But now that it was here, he felt only sorrow. Atlantis had been a place of beauty, a place where the gods themselves had walked, and now it would be lost forever. The final moments of Atlantis were quiet. The sounds of the crashing waves and the trembling earth faded into a deep silence as the city sank beneath the ocean. The last remnants of the city disappeared into the depths, and soon all that remained was the endless sea. The city of Atlantis was no more. Chapter 5. Though Atlantis was gone, its legacy was not forgotten. The ruins of the city lay deep beneath the waves, hidden from the world. But the power of the crystal, though dimmed, still lingered in the darkened depths, waiting. For centuries, the story of Atlantis was passed down through whispers and legends. Sailors spoke of strange lights beneath the sea, of ruins glimpsed in the depths on calm nights. Some said the city still existed, trapped in time, waiting for the day when it would rise again. But the truth of Atlantis remained a mystery, buried beneath the waves, hidden from the eyes of the world. The knowledge of the crystal and the power it held was lost to all but the sea. Yet there were those who believed that the city's secrets were not lost forever, that one day the crystal's light would shine again. The Survivor's Journey. Chapter 1. As the mighty city of Atlantis sank beneath the waves, not all was lost. Far from the crumbling towers and flooded streets, a handful of Atlanteans fled, some by ship, others by small enchanted crafts that skimmed the surface of the roiling sea. They were the few who had heeded the warnings of the high priest Callistos, and as the earth shook and the waves crashed, they escaped just before the final cataclysm swallowed the city whole. Among the survivors was Eryx, a former captain of Atlantis's navy. Eryx had long served the crown, but he had grown wary of the ruler's obsession with power. In the days before the fall, Eryx had gathered his family and a small group of loyal sailors. He had sensed, as Callistos did, that Atlantis was on the verge of destruction. As the city descended into chaos, he led them to the harbor and set sail toward the open sea. Beside him was Lyra, a skilled healer, and one of the few who knew how to harness the ancient arts of Atlantis for good. Lyra had cared for the city's sick and wounded, but now her focus was on survival. She carried with her a precious relic, an orb of crystal, a fragment of the great Atlantean crystal that had powered their city. Though it was small, it held a fraction of the same energy that had once brought life to Atlantis, and Lyra believed it could help them rebuild their lives far from the city they once called home. The survivors sailed west, leaving the dying city behind. They did not look back. The waves of the ocean soon swallowed Atlantis, and with it, their past. Chapter 2. For days, the small fleet of Atlantean ships drifted on the open sea. The survivors had little sense of direction, trusting only the stars and the distant hope that some distant land awaited them. They faced turbulent waves, howling winds, and nights filled with the eerie silence of the endless ocean. Eryx stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had always been a man of action, but now he felt the weight of responsibility like never before. The survivors looked to him for guidance, and though his heart ached for the home they had lost, he knew he could not let despair overtake him.
"The gods will guide us," Lyra often said.
her soft voice a comfort to the weary crew. She spent much of her time in the hold of the ship, studying the orb, hoping to unlock the secrets it carried. The crystal fragment glowed faintly in her hands, as if it too were searching for the remnants of the ancient energy that once flowed through Atlantis. Lyra had learned the healing arts from the high priests, and she believed that the crystal was more than just a relic of their lost city. It held the potential to heal, to guide them to a new beginning, but the sea stretched endlessly before them, and no land had yet appeared on the horizon. One evening, as the sun sank low, casting golden light across the waves, Lyra approached Eryx at the helm. "I've had a vision," she whispered. "There is a land far to the west, a place where the power of Atlantis can be reborn." Eryx frowned, his eyes narrowing. "A vision? Are you sure?" Lyra nodded. "I saw it in the orb. The gods have not abandoned us. They are leading us to a new home." With renewed hope, Eryx steered the ship westward, trusting in Lyra's vision. Chapter 3. Days passed, and the ocean continued to stretch out before them. Supplies began to dwindle, and the crew grew restless. Some whispered that they had been cursed, that Atlantis's fall had doomed them to wander the seas forever. But Lyra remained steadfast. She could feel the pull of the crystal, guiding them toward something. She spent her days in deep meditation, her hands resting on the orb as she sought to uncover its secrets. Then one morning, as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the lookout shouted from above, "Land! Land ahead!" Eryx rushed to the bow, his heart racing. There, on the horizon, was a small island, lush with greenery and ringed with white sand beaches. It was unlike any place he had ever seen, a hidden paradise, untouched by time. As the ships drew closer, Lyra stood beside him, her eyes filled with wonder. "This is the place," she whispered. "This is where we will rebuild." The survivors landed on the island, their feet sinking into the soft sand as they stepped ashore. The island was rich with life, trees heavy with fruit, fresh water bubbling from hidden springs. It was a place of abundance, a place where they could begin again. But as they explored further, they discovered something even more remarkable. At the center of the island stood an ancient stone structure, overgrown with vines and moss. It was clear that they were not the first to set foot on this land. The ruins were old, older than Atlantis itself. Lyra approached the ruins cautiously, her hand resting on the crystal orb. As she neared the center of the structure, the orb began to glow, brighter than it ever had before. "There's something here," she whispered, "something powerful." Chapter 4. The survivors gathered around the ancient ruins, their curiosity piqued. Eryx, Lyra, and a small group of explorers ventured deeper into the stone structure, finding chambers carved into the earth, filled with strange symbols and forgotten relics. The air was thick with an ancient energy, a power that felt both familiar and foreign. Lyra, holding the glowing orb, felt a deep connection to the place. The energy that radiated from the walls resonated with the crystal she carried. It was as if the island itself held a piece of the same divine power that had once flowed through Atlantis. "These are the markings of an ancient civilization," Eric said, his fingers tracing the carvings on the wall. One that existed long before Atlantis. Lyra nodded. This place, it's connected to Atlantis somehow. The gods brought us here for a reason. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, they discovered a large chamber at the heart of the structure. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, upon which rested a larger crystal, similar to the one Lyra carried, but far more powerful. Its surface glowed with a faint blue light, and the air around it crackled with energy. "This is what the gods led us to," Lyra said, her voice filled with awe. "This crystal, it holds the same power as the one we lost in Atlantis." Eric's approached the altar cautiously. "What do we do with it?" Lyra smiled softly. "We protect it. We rebuild, and we ensure that the mistakes of Atlantis are never repeated." Chapter 5. The survivors of Atlantis began a new life on the island. They rebuilt their homes using the knowledge and skills they had brought with them from their fallen city. But this time, they did so with humility, with an understanding that the power they wielded was a gift, not a right. Lyra, with the help of the high priests, placed the new crystal in a sacred temple they built at the heart of the island. The crystal's energy provided them with the means to thrive, to heal, and to grow, but they never again sought to control or manipulate it as their ancestors had in Atlantis. Over time, the island flourished, and the survivors began to see it not as a place of exile, but as a new beginning. The story of Atlantis was passed down to the next generation as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without balance could lead to destruction. But the legacy of Atlantis was not forgotten. The knowledge and wisdom of the ancient city lived on in the survivors and in the crystal they had found. They had been given a second chance, and this time they would not squander it. The Rise of Atlantis. Chapter 1. In the distant past, long before the world was as we know it, the gods walked the earth, shaping mountains and seas with their mighty hands. Among them was Poseidon, the god of the seas, who held a deep love for the earth and all its creatures. One day, while walking the shores of a remote island in the heart of the great ocean, Poseidon beheld a woman of unparalleled beauty. Her name was Cleito, and she lived alone on the island, tending to the animals and the wild lands. Poseidon, struck by her grace and kindness, fell in love with Cleito, and from their union a new race was born, the Atlanteans. Poseidon blessed them with wisdom, strength, and a love for the sea. To honor Cleito and their children, Poseidon created a magnificent city on the island, a place that would become the most advanced and beautiful civilization the world had ever known. The city of Atlantis rose from the earth like a jewel, surrounded by concentric rings of water and land. Its streets were lined with shimmering stone, its towers gleamed in the sunlight, and at its heart there stood a great temple, where the sacred power of Atlantis was kept safe. This power was the gift of the gods, and it was to be guarded by the people of Atlantis for generations to come. Chapter 2. The Atlanteans flourished in their new home, and under Poseidon's guidance, they built a society unlike any other. Their knowledge of the stars, the earth, and the sea surpassed all other civilizations. They tamed the wild oceans, built great ships that sailed across the world, and discovered the secrets of the Earth's energy. They harnessed the power of nature, bending it to their will, but always in balance with the world around them. In the great temple at the center of the city, the sacred Crystal of Atlantis pulsed with light. It was the source of the city's power, a crystal that held the energy of the gods themselves. The Atlanteans used this crystal to fuel their inventions, create endless crops, and even heal the sick. It was said that anyone who stood in the presence of the crystal could feel the wisdom of the gods flowing through them. This was the golden age of Atlantis. The people were prosperous, and peace reigned over the land. The rulers of Atlantis, descendants of Poseidon and Cleito, governed with wisdom and fairness, and the city became a beacon of light for the rest of the world. From distant shores, kings and queens sailed to Atlantis to learn from its scholars and to marvel at its wonders. But as time passed, the Atlanteans began to forget the humble origins of their city. They became proud and ambitious, eager to expand their influence across the world. The wisdom of the gods, once cherished, began to be overshadowed by a desire for power. Chapter 3. The high priests of Atlantis, keepers of the sacred knowledge, began to notice a change in the crystal's glow. Where once it shone with the soft, pure light of the gods, it now flickered and pulsed with an uneasy energy. The high priest, an old and wise man named Callistos, feared that something was wrong. He had long warned the rulers of Atlantis that their growing ambition could anger the gods, but his words fell on deaf ears. One night, as Callistos meditated in the temple, he received a vision, a dark and terrible vision of Atlantis in ruins, swallowed by the sea. He saw the great towers crumbling, the rivers of the city overflowing, and the cries of the people as the waves engulfed them. The crystal, once so powerful, shattered into 1,000 pieces, its light extinguished forever. Callistos awoke in a cold sweat, knowing that this was not just a dream, but a warning from the gods themselves. He rushed to the palace to speak with the rulers, but they dismissed his fears. "Atlantis is too powerful to fall," they said. "We are the chosen people of the gods." But Callistos knew the truth. The gods had blessed Atlantis with power, but they could also take it away. He returned to the temple, knowing that the city was now on the brink of disaster. Chapter 4. Weeks passed, and soon the signs of trouble became impossible to ignore. The seas around Atlantis, once calm and bountiful, grew turbulent. Storms unlike any the Atlanteans had seen before lashed the shores, and the great ships of Atlantis, once masters of the ocean, were tossed like leaves in the wind. The crystal's light, which had once illuminated the city like the sun, now dimmed. The high priests gathered in the temple day and night, praying to the gods for guidance, but the only answer they received was silence. The rulers of Atlantis, desperate to maintain their power, sought to expand their empire even further, believing that conquering new lands would appease the gods. But Callistos knew that it was not the expansion that would save Atlantis, but humility and remembrance of their origins. The city had lost its way, and the gods would not stand idly by. The first earthquake struck at dawn. The people awoke to the ground shaking beneath their feet, buildings swaying, and the sound of the earth groaning in pain. Panic spread through the city, but still the rulers refused to listen to the warnings. "It is just a tremor," they said. The gods would never destroy their greatest creation. But Callistos knew better. The omens were clear. Atlantis was on the verge of a catastrophe, one that could not be undone. Chapter 5. The once glorious city was now shrouded in fear and uncertainty. The storms raged on, and the earthquakes grew more frequent. Yet, amidst the chaos, the rulers of Atlantis made one final, desperate attempt to reclaim the favor of the gods. They sought to use the full power of the crystal to channel its energy in a way never before attempted. If they could harness the crystal's full potential, they believed they could avert the disaster and restore their city to its former glory. Callistos, seeing the hubris of their decision, knew that this would be their undoing. The crystal was not meant to be used in such a way, and tampering with the energy of the gods would only bring about their destruction. But he was powerless to stop them. The rulers had made their choice. As the high priests prepared the crystal for the ritual, Callistos retreated to the temple one last time. There, in the stillness of the sacred halls, he prayed not for the salvation of Atlantis, but for its people, to find peace in the face of the inevitable. He knew the end was near. The crystal began to glow once more, brighter than ever before, but this time its light was not a blessing. It was a warning, a beacon of the doom that awaited Atlantis. The Return of Atlantis. Chapter 1. For centuries, the story of Atlantis had been buried beneath the waves, preserved only in the whispered legends of sailors and scholars. The survivors of the great city had built new lives on distant shores, passing down the knowledge of their lost civilization, but even they had never imagined that Atlantis might one day rise again. Far beneath the ocean's surface, where the sun's light could not reach, the ruins of Atlantis lay in silence. The grand towers had crumbled, the great temples were submerged in sand, and the crystal that had once pulsed with life now lay dormant, its light extinguished. Yet even in this forgotten place, something stirred. Deep within the ruins, an ancient energy, long dormant, began to awaken. In the heart of the lost city, the remains of the great crystal began to pulse faintly, its fractured surface glowing with a flicker of light. The energy that had once fueled the mighty empire had not been destroyed. It had simply been waiting for the right moment, for the right force, to awaken it once more. Far above, on a quiet island where the descendants of Atlantis lived, a tremor shook the earth. Lyra, the healer who had carried the fragment of the Atlantean crystal all those years ago, stood at the edge of the island, her hand on the small orb that had guided her people to this new land. She felt the pulse, a deep resonance that vibrated through the air and sea. It was the same energy she had felt when Atlantis was on the verge of destruction, but this time it was different. "The crystal," she whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "It's calling to us." Chapter 2. Lyra had known, deep in her heart, that one day the power of Atlantis would rise again. The island they had discovered was no accident. It was a place connected to the ancient world in ways that only the priests of old had understood. The ruins they had found, the ancient crystal at the heart of the island, it was all part of a larger prophecy, one that had been foretold before the fall of Atlantis. As the tremors continued to shake the island, Lyra gathered the elders of her people. Among them was Eryx, the former captain, who had led them across the sea. His hair was now streaked with grey, but his spirit was as strong as ever. "We have felt this energy before," Lyra told them, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "The crystal beneath the ocean is awakening. Atlantis is stirring." The elders exchanged uneasy glances. For years they had lived in peace on their new island, building a life far from the dangers of their past. The story of Atlantis' fall was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when power was abused. But now the very power they had fled seemed to be calling them back. "What does this mean for us?" Eryx asked, his brow furrowed. Lyra took a deep breath. "It means that Atlantis may rise again, and with it, the knowledge and power we thought were lost forever." The elders were silent for a moment, each contemplating the weight of her words. To return to Atlantis would be to confront their past, to face the very force that had destroyed their city. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to recover the lost knowledge of their ancestors, to rebuild what had been lost. "We must go," Lyra said firmly. "The crystal is calling us for a reason. If Atlantis rises again, we must be there to guide it, to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated." Reluctantly, the elders agreed. They would journey back to the place they had once called home. Chapter 3. Preparations were made quickly, and within days, Lyra, Eryx, and a small group of explorers set sail for the site where Atlantis had once stood. The ocean was calm as they sailed, but beneath the surface, the ancient forces at work were anything but peaceful. As they neared the location where Atlantis had once risen proudly above the waves, Lyra could feel the crystal's energy growing stronger. The orb she carried glowed faintly, resonating with the power deep beneath the ocean floor. She knew they were close. Using a combination of ancient Atlantean technology and the healing arts passed down from the high priests, Lyra and her team descended into the depths of the ocean. Encased in protective bubbles of energy, they floated through the dark waters, guided by the faint glow of the crystal. The ruins of Atlantis came into view slowly, emerging from the darkness like a forgotten dream. The once grand city was now a shadow of its former self. Its towers crumbled, its streets submerged in sand and silt. But at the heart of the city, the crystal lay in its ancient temple, flickering with life. Lyra and Eryx stood before the crystal, its fractured surface glowing faintly in the dark waters. Lyra reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the crystal. As she did, a surge of energy coursed through her, connecting her to the power that had once sustained the entire city. "It's alive," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The crystal is still alive." Chapter 4. The explorers worked quickly, using the knowledge they had preserved over the centuries to repair the broken crystal. It was a delicate process, one that required the careful balance of energy and intention. Lyra guided them, using the small orb she had carried all these years to help restore the larger crystal to its former glory. As the final piece of the crystal was put into place, the energy within it surged. The temple walls trembled, and the waters around them began to churn with power. The crystal, once dark and fractured, now pulsed with a brilliant light, brighter than it had ever been. The energy of Atlantis flowed through the city once more. The ruins, long submerged in darkness, began to glow with life. The streets, the towers, the temples, they all shimmered with the light of the crystal, as if the city itself was awakening from a long slumber. But this was not the same Atlantis that had fallen all those centuries ago. This was a new beginning, a rebirth. The crystal had been restored, but its power was no longer tied to the ambition and greed of the past. It was now a force for balance, for healing, for renewal. As the explorers stood in awe of the city's transformation, Lyra felt a deep sense of peace. The crystal had called them back to Atlantis for a reason. The city had been given a second chance, and this time they would not repeat the mistakes of the past. "Atlantis is reborn," Lyra said softly, her eyes filled with wonder. "And this time we will use its power wisely." Chapter 5. As Atlantis rose once more from the depths of the ocean, the world was forever changed. The lost city, once thought to be nothing more than a legend, had returned to the surface, its ancient knowledge and power restored. Lyra, Eryx, and the other explorers returned to their island, but they knew that their journey was far from over. The rebirth of Atlantis marked the beginning of a new era, one where the wisdom of the past could guide the future. Word of Atlantis's return spread across the world, and soon people from distant lands began to seek out the lost city, hoping to learn from its ancient knowledge. But Lyra and her people were careful. They understood the responsibility that came with the power of Atlantis, and they would not allow it to be misused again. As the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, casting golden light over the newly risen city, Lyra stood at the edge of the water, the orb still glowing softly in her hand. She smiled, knowing that the future of Atlantis was in good hands. The city had been given a second chance, and this time it would stand as a beacon of hope, a symbol of balance and harmony between humanity and the earth. The crystal pulsed gently, its light reflecting in the waters of the ocean. Atlantis had returned, and with it the promise of a new beginning,